This is Amy Ritter, Scientific Editor with BioPharm International, and I'm speaking today with Dr. Armand Keating, Epstein Chair in Cell Therapy and Transplantation at the University of Toronto. Dr. Keating will be speaking at the Bio International Convention in a session titled Opportunities and Challenges in Developing Innovative Stem Cell Therapies. Thank you for speaking with me today, Dr. Keating.
It's a pleasure.
So, of all the different types of stem cells being developed as therapeutics, mesenchymal stem cells are perhaps one of the furthest along in terms of being ready for clinical use. Can you begin by describing what these cells are and what types of applications are they being developed for?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right that these have moved further than any other cell type. I should just preface those remarks by saying that the most successful form of regenerative medicine and cell therapy is bone marrow transplantation or blood and marrow transplantation. So we've been there before, and I think that there are a number of lessons we can learn from our 50-year experience with blood and marrow transplantation. I think in the last year or so, worldwide, there have been about 1 million transplants performed. But moving then to this other population, the so-called mesenchymal stem cells, I actually prefer to use the term mesenchymal stromal cells, because while this population does contain a small proportion of stem cells, the beneficial effect of these cells is probably not related to their stemness, shall we say. And I've been trying to get some data on how many studies and what the indications are for the use of mesenchymal stromal cells, let's call them MSCs. And I've trolled clinical trials. This is the U.S. National Institutes of Health, clinicaltrials.gov website that includes all registered clinical trials of this kind. Registration is required if individuals want to have their publication describing the results of the trial published. And in that analysis, what I came up with was that there were about 1,600 or so cell therapy trials, and of those, about 156 or so, around 9%, used mesenchymal stromal cells. And as best I could judge, the top indications for their use were issues with regard to bone, joints, and cartilage. That represented about 19%. Graft versus host disease, which we can discuss later, and that's, I think, a very interesting indication and relies on the immune suppressive properties of this population. Cardiac regeneration, 10%, liver, 10%, diabetes, 5%, and ischemia, 5% as well. There was a publication on this topic, and it came out last year, looking at the European data, and what they observed was about 627 exactly 627 treatments. 245 of them were from the patient themselves, and 382 were from somebody else. And the breakdown there is about 70% were what we call autoimmune, 20% were musculoskeletal, and 5% were cardiovascular. So a little bit different from our experience in the US and North America generally.
So as far as commercialization of this type of cell therapy, what do you see as being the biggest hurdles?
Well, that's really a major issue, and I think we could break it down into two components. And this is, I think, true. It's a generic issue for cell therapy, but it certainly does apply to MSC use. The first is preclinical studies that required, in order to obtain an IND in the US or a CTA in Canada. And the difficulty there is the source of the funding for those studies. Those can be moderately expensive, but the challenge is to find funding for studies that really aren't hypothesis-driven. Most of our research is based on evaluation of projects, is based on hypothesis-driven work. And this, of course, has gone a step beyond that. The hypothesis has been established, and there are very good data that may well have been published in outstanding journals, but the difficulty is how do you translate those laboratory observations to the clinic? And the FDA and other similar agencies require validation and preclinical data demonstrating both safety and efficacy. Neither of those sorts of applications to study sections are really going to receive a particularly good score because they'll be competing with more conventional hypothesis-driven research, which is very vigorous. Here we're really attempting to validate something, demonstrate its safety and efficacy. So that's one area where I think it's a real challenge. The second is in moving to the next step, which is to actually do what are called dry runs, which is scaling up and performing the cell manufacture with all the tests that are required, short of actually administering it to a patient. So you have all the expense of conducting that, and the expectation is that you would do 2 or 3 such dry runs. So that needs to be funded somehow, and it's absolutely vital because it isn't necessarily a linear process going from laboratory scale manufacturing to clinical manufacturing. And then the final aspect of that is how to actually fund the cell manufacturing for patients in a clinical trial. And many of these trials are investigator-driven and are not supported by industry. So unlike drug development studies, which may well be supported by industry, this is significantly less common, and so more of a challenge. So it's really the funding for this work from the observation that's been made through to the completion of early phase clinical trials. I think they're so expensive that it's very unlikely that later phase clinical trials, particularly prospective randomized trials or double-blind randomized trials, can be accomplished at academic health science centers with manufactured cells. It's just enormously expensive to do that. So there needs to be some way of dealing with that. And there aren't that many options. One option is to rely on philanthropy at academic health science centers. The other option is if you happen to be in California and you have such a study with a stem cell population or a specialized cell population, then the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine may consider funding those because they have the resources to do that. I think that's a very important initiative that should be lauded. They are the main issues. I think the scientific issues can be addressed in the usual way, and I think there's now pretty reasonable experience both at academic centers and also in industry, obviously, to deal with many of the regulatory issues. They're not as onerous as the regulatory issues that confront individuals wishing to do gene therapy, for example, but they're still formidable.
Great. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you very much indeed, Amy.